Morning, Ellie.
Yes. Okay. Good morning, everyone. We're just about ready to start. We're taking the Gemara again from Nun Hey Amud Base 55b in Sukkah. We're going to be starting again that Mishnah towards the end of the Amud, which is about 9 lines down towards the end of the line. Bishlosha Prokim Bashana. Just a reminder that last week and the week before, we had a discussion about the 24 Mishmarot Kahuna, the 24 watches of Kohanim who used to come down from different towns, family groupings, and they each used to serve for a week in the Avodah of the Beis Hamikdash, and then they, according to a rota, were replaced by another Mishmar. And this went on, and at the end of 24 weeks, the whole cycle started again. And the Mishnah told us that as we're dealing with Sukkot, during Sukkot and Shmini Atzeres, all the 24 Mishmarot worked together. During Sukkot, there were very many korbanot, and there was enough work to allocate to all the groups of Kohanim, all the 24. And we went through the very detailed description of the allocation, how many bullocks were serviced by how many groups, and then how many goats and lambs, etc. It was quite a complicated table I set up for you. And that went through the 7 days of Sukkot, with each Mishmar having a pre-allocated task set. And then when it came to Shmini Atzeres, which is the 8th day, there were very, very few korbanot, or the amount of avodah in the Bnei Hamikdash suddenly collapses to a very minimal amount of work, the general daily korbanot, plus just a very few particular chag korbanot. Then you've got all 24 mishmarot there. So what are they all going to do? And the Mishnah said that on that 8th day, given that there was not enough work for everyone to do, the system reverted to that dictated by the pious, the lottery, and tasks were allocated according to this thumbs up lottery, which I explained to you, where you put up fingers and those fingers were counted, and it was decided who would do what, simply based upon the game of lottery, which you could say was random, you could say was God selected, but that meant a lot of Kohanim were not doing anything. That was the situation for the 8th day, where there were very few korbanot. The Gemara also said at the end, just before our Mishnah over here, what marked out Shmini Atzeres from the other 7 days of Sukkot. Shmini Atzeres we understand to be a Chag Bifnei Atzmo, a festival of its own, really, and yet it's linked to the end of Sukkot, 7 days of Sukkot, and then you have Shmini Atzeres. Why is the 8th day different, you might ask, as if it were the Manishtana question. Why is the 8th day different from all the other 7 days? And during all the other 7 days, not only is it a different chag, there's a din of sitting in the sukkah, etc., which there isn't on Shmini Atzeres. There is also the collapse in the number of korbanot. Why is that all different? So the Chazal tell us in the Gemara that if you like, all those 7 days, there was a total of 70 bullocks offered up, and those 70 bullocks represent a sacrifices on behalf of all the 70 nations of the world, Shivim Umot. So they all have, if you like, a representative korban for them. And the Beis HaMikdash is dealing in their favor and in their honor. Each genetic ummah, however you can recognize them, has its own korban assigned to them. But on the 8th day of Sukkot, if you like, Shmini Atzeret, that's something completely different. HaKadosh Baruch Hu essentially says we've had a universalistic cosmopolitan 7 days where we have celebrated in a very universal style across all the Ummot Olam, but on the 8th day it's just me and you. It's just Klal Yisrael and HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We remain behind for a final day, and that final day therefore has very few korbanot and very few mitzvot as well. There's a lot of davening, but very few mitzvot. It's if you like, an intimate meeting point and final parting occasion between HaKadosh Baruch Hu and Klal Yisrael, that very 8th day. Okay. So we're going to start this Mishnah, Bishlosha Prokim. We did start it last time. I'm going to flesh out some of these points again in somewhat greater detail, and we will look at some illustrations as well to brighten up the scene. So the Mishnah says, Bishlosha Prokim Bashona, Hayukol Mishmarot Shavot. On 3 occasions in the year, all the Mishmarot, all those 24 Kohanic groups, were dealt with on an equal basis. They had an equal participation and share, be'emorei haragolim, in dividing up the pickings, if you like, of the korbanos of the regalim, those bits that the Kohanim were entitled to. All 24 mishmoros shared in those. This is, if you like, a spillover from the Gemara we've just been learning about the 24 mishmorot. We talked about how they all come together during Sukkot. So the Mishnah here is saying that they didn't just come together for Sukkot. All 24 mishmorot came together for all of the Chagim. On a normal week, it would just be the Mishmar HaMiyuchad LeShabbat HaHu. The Shabbat HaHi would just be what was the normal rota for that week. And we saw what that rota was. Brought a table last week and the week before showing all the names of the Mishmarot and which weeks, so to speak, they served in the order of their numbers, if you like, in a chronological order. There was no infighting between them necessarily. They all had a designated Shabbat, but they came together on 3 occasions, and those were the Shalosh Regalim: Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot, and Shmini Atzeres at the end of Sukkot. The Mishnah is telling us that this happened 3 times during those 3 regalim, and it's also telling us that in addition to the fact that they all served together on those 3 regalim, they also all ate together. When I say ate together, I mean that the meat of the korban and also those extra other bits like the skins or whatever it is that were apportioned to the Kohanim, those bits of the korbanos that are eaten and not actually roasted up on the Mizbeach, if you like, and there are a lot of parts that are actually eaten by the Kohanim, and they're entitled to the skins of many of those korbanos. It's quite complicated what they are and what they aren't entitled to, but all 24 mishmaros shared in the gains. We would not just allocate a particular meat of a korban to that particular Kohen or group that was working on that particular korban and say each only gains benefit from what he was working on, but rather there was an equal division of all of those korbanos amongst all those 24 groups. And I imagine it had to be fairly well organized in order for that to be sustained in practice, because there were a lot of Kohanim working. So they were all in it together, in both in the work and also in the consumption of the korbanos themselves. Okay. As we'll see later on, we need to be just a little bit careful here when I say all the korbanos of the Chag. They were equally apportioned. They were apportioned. It's only the specific Chag-related korbanos that had that benefit of being equally apportioned across the 24 groups. Because if you like, they were only working together because it was a Chag. Now, there are many other korbanos offered up, as we'll see later on as well, which were not to do with the Chag itself, but just happened to come because it was a normal day. The korban Tomid, Baboka, and then Batzoraim, the 2 korbanos Tomid, which are communal offerings, come every day of the year. And those are not specific Chag korbanot. So therefore, they only belong to the particular mishmar whose rota would actually be for that particular week. It's only the specific korbanos which are attributable to the Chag itself, the korban musaf of the Chag, the extra korbanos that the Chag requires us to bring, like we saw those 70 bullocks on Sukkot. Those are the real korbanos achag. Those are the ones that are actually allocated, distributed across all the 24 mishmaros. The Mishnah goes on to say, "Ubechilok lechem haponim," and also in the division of the showbread. So this is something else that was a responsibility of the Kohanim. The Kohanim used to bring in to the shulchan in the ulam of the Beis Hamikdash. They used to bring in the showbread on a Shabbat, and they used to take out the old. Every week there was a new, we're hearing the jets flying overhead. Every week there was a new set of 12 loaves, which are the lechem haponim, freshly baked contingent of lechem haponim that was brought in on a Shabbos. At the same time, the previous weeks was taken out, and the previous weeks were eaten. And according to tradition, they still remain just as fresh as they had been as on the moment they were actually taken in. So this was 12 huge loaves, and we'll learn a little bit more about them in a moment. But they were also divided equally across the 24 mishmaros on the Shabbos of the Chag, because the changeover, if you like, the old set was only taken out on a Shabbat. So this is not a daily Chag thing, but when Shabbat occurred on a Chag, then the Lechem Haponim then was divided. The old set that was being taken out to be replaced, that old set of 12 loaves is divided across all 24 sets. Now, this is a bit unusual because the Lechem Haponim was not a particular Yontov type korban. So there's a somewhat of an exception over here. It's something that happens every week on a Shabbat. So why not just leave it with the group, the mishmar of that particular week? But no, the Mishnah says this was another benefit that was distributed across all the 24 groups when the Shabbat fell on a Chag. And also Ba'atzeres, the Shtei HaLechem, that's not very clear. There are 2 loaves that were brought as part of a specific offering of the Shavuos ceremony. And this also was divided according to all the 24 groups, rather than just being left with one. Now that's easier to understand because the Shtei HaLechem was a specific Yontov type of korban, whereas the Lechem Haponim is something that happens every Shabbat. So certainly we would expect the Shtei HaLechem to be made available to all the korbanos, to all the Kohanim, to all the Mishmaros, and that's what the Mishnah tells us over here. We'll just go a little bit further. We'll go to the end of the Mishnah. We start trying to flesh out some of these cases in the Mishnah. The Mishnah is on a flow here. So Omelo, the Mishnah is rather acutely says that the administrator Cohen, the Cohen is in charge of the pious, the allocation of tasks. He, the organizing Cohen, the managing Cohen, Omelo, he would say to every Cohen who was coming to collect his share of either the Lechem Haponim or the Shtei HaLechem. Yes, they all stood in a long, long line with their hands out, waiting to receive a little bit of the loaf, a kazayas or whatever it is. It may not have been much more than a kazayas because many Kohanim wanted to take part of the Lechem Haponim. And the Lechem Haponim were 12 loaves, they're not 100 loaves, and it's not indefinite. And the Shtei HaLechem the same. So when the distributing Cohen passed out the shares to each of the Kohanim coming to collect their chelik, he used to say to them, Heilech matzah, here you have a bit of matzah, Heilech chometz. Very strange statement. Here you have a piece of chometz. What does that mean? He may not have said it at the same time. What the Mishnah means over here is that when it comes to the Lechem Haponim, and we'll have a look at that in a bit more detail, surprisingly enough, Lechem Haponim was matzah. It wasn't wholemeal or anything like that. It was matzah bread. And if he was distributing Lechem Haponim to the Kohanim, he would say, here you have a nice piece of matzah. If he was distributing on a Shavuot, Atzeret, if he was distributing the Shtei HaLechem, the 2 loaves that are part of the Shavuot ceremony, he would say, Hey la chometz, because those 2 were made of chometz. That differentiated the Lechem Haponim from the Shtei HaLechem. Otherwise, it seems they may have looked much the same. There were 12 loaves of the Lechem Haponim every Shabbat, and there were 2 loaves on Shavuot of Shtei HaLechem. The Shabbat stuff was all matzah, and the Shtei HaLechem on Shavuot was chometz. Okay. Says the Mishnah further, Mishmar shem zamano kavua, the Mishmar for which it was their week. And remember, all 24 are coming together, but still, that week of Yontov where they were all coming together, still had a designated group. If you look on the calendar, it had their name. It is their Mishmar's rota. That Mishmar, who makriv it specifically and alone, would do the hakravot of all the non-Yontov specific korbanot, as I explained to you. It would be their specific duty and no other mishmar's duties to do the stuff that was to do in the Beis HaMikdash that was not as a part of Yontov, but rather the daily and the occasional ceremony that's not Yontov based. So we're giving examples over here. The specific mishmar are for that week's rota, whom akriv tamidim, the korban tomid, the two korbanos tomid during the day. They were tomid, they were brought every single day of the year. And so they're not specific to Yontov activity, and therefore was only the specific mishmar for that week that would have the job of offering up the tomid. Also, nedarim v'nedavot, the sacrifices that were brought to the Beis HaMikdash on account of the vows made by Klal Yisrael. People used to come, make a vow, say, make a neder, I'll pledge an oath, and I'm going to bring a goat to the Beis HaMikdash as part of my Simchas HaYontov, or whatever it is, and they would bring it up perhaps on Yontov as well. Unadovos and gift offerings, which are much the same, but without a neder being made. They want to bring a nedova to the Beis HaMikdash as an animal. So those also would be offered only by the Mishmar HaKavua, by those whose rota turn it was this particular week. Why not anyone else's? Why not the others? Because these two are not part of Korbanot HaChag, not specific to the Chag. Now, as the commentaries point out, they tended to be brought during the Chag. Why? Because the time of Aliyah L'Regel. Aliyah L'Regel is when the Jewish people come up to Yerushalayim. So if they have made a neder, or they wish to bring in a dova, rather than bringing it up during the year, which is another chore, they would bring it together with their presence on Aliyah L'Regel. So there would be a lot of nedarim and nedavot during those weeks, but they're not specific to the regel. They're not mandated by the regel. It's just a convenience. The Klal Yisrael would bring them during the regel. And therefore, they would be attended to just by the mishmar whose rota fell on that particular week. And also our korbanos sibur and any other korban sibur that was not regel related, makriv zakol, that mishmar of that particular week would perform the offering. So that's the Mishnah. So the Mishnah has given us an idea, again, of the workflow in the Beis HaMikdash, which is very useful because we are very, very far removed from it. And even though we may not feel we really need to know about it, there was a system, and the system was sophisticated, and the Mishnah gives us access to that system that we might not otherwise have had. So I'm going to share my screen over here. I'm just going to go back to try and flesh out some of the detail and some of the more interesting parts of that Mishnah. So I'll talk a little bit about the Lechem HaPonim. This is the most popular picture you see of the Lechem HaPonim. Actually, it looks like the library shelves. I've always used to think I was looking at library shelves when I saw these bookcases. But in fact, this is meant to be the Shulchan in gold. The color scheme, I think, is really wrong because it wouldn't all be gold. Here's the bread. The bread is also in gold. Now look, what you have over here is you have 12 loaves, but they don't look like loaves. They look rather like boxes, each of them on a shelf. There are 6 shelves on one vertical column, on one bookcase, and there's another bookcase that's all part of the Shulchan, and there's another 6, right? This is 1, 2, this whole unit is one showbread, a very strange shape. And that's why it's called Lechem HaPonim, by the way. There's a machlokus a bit about how they look, but this is the most popular representation. Lechem HaPonim means the bread of faces. And you can see why it has faces, not faces in the form of mouth and nose, but that it has different aspects to it. It's curled over, it has an inside and outside, a top, a side. It's a very unusual structure. If you want to look at it better, you can see over here, this guy looks like he's carrying a fruit crate, but it's not a fruit crate. Let me just make this larger, and you can see he's just baked a fresh lechem HaPonim, this man over here. And here you can see it's got these what look like arms in. It has an underneath, it has sides, and it seems to arch over then it has an empty inside under those arches. It's a very unusual shape indeed. This is one loaf, pretty big. So there were 12 of those, and here they are stacked, 1, 2, 3, etc. So this is the idea of the lechem haponim. And as I say, according to the Torah and according to the way the Mishnah understands it, a fresh contingent was baked each week. The old one was taken out on the Shabbat by the mishmar leaving, the mishmar that was going home, and the new mishmar that was coming in would at the same time bring in the new set of 12. And the lechem haponim, the old set, which was now not going to be used anymore, would be eaten and distributed amongst the Kohanim. I don't know where. I think it would be eaten in the Beis Hamikdash. It wouldn't be eaten outside the Beis Hamikdash. I don't know whether we're allowed to put butter and jam on it. I don't know the details, but it was supposed to be very delicious. Let me just go down to show you this, which is really quite interesting. This is a coin, both sides, the two sides of a coin of the last Hasmonean king, Mattisyahu Antigonus. So this is about 100 years before Churban HaBayis. So the bias is extant. You know, this is not just a distant memory. Interestingly, though, this is meant to be a menorah. Well, that's quite clear. And by the way, it's a curved menorah. You know, people always say, well, maybe it was triangular, maybe the menorah was like this, maybe it was like that. We all use menorahs that look like that and curved. Chabad tend to use these triangular menorahs based upon a version in the Rambam, Maimonides. But over here you have what seems to be a proper curved one, very much one as we have today. Does this settle the argument that the menorah in the Beis Hamikdash was shaped as we have today with bow-shaped curves? I always think it does, but there are some others who take pictures they find elsewhere which seem to depict it in more of a triangular form. But anyway, this one, and this is 100 years before Churban HaBayis, so these people would have seen the menorah, shows it as being curved arms as the way we normally use on a Hanukkah. But over here is the shulchan. Doesn't look too much like the shulchan I have over here. So one of the questions is, why doesn't it look like that? It looks like an ordinary table. There's your table. It doesn't have any of these shelvings going up in the air, which were depicted in the model above. And here are the breads. I'm not sure there's 6 here, but what they look rather like curved plates of bananas. 1, 2, probably 6 over here and 6 over there. So they seem to arch up at the end. Interestingly, there's a view, I think Rashi brings it as well, there's a view that the showbreads were shaped like ships, like boats. There's a machlokas. Now, this box type unit over here is not, it's very, very straight edged, doesn't look at all like a ship. But over here, you know, could almost be a rowing boat, a canoe or something, and you've got you have a boat type shape. So again, the jury's out over here. Is this what the lechem haponim really looked like, or did it look more like that we show over here? Difficult to say. Historically, we don't really know. I guess one thing one should say is not to be too captivated by images you see on coins. The coins that we have, very often, they're the closest we have to the depicting the actual situation, because these coins go back 2,000 years to the time of the Bias. It's not a matter of imagination. You'd think they were accurate depictions, but they're not necessarily. They're often just symbolic. They're symbolic of certain mitzvot. So someone putting a coin together like that would have said, Shulchan means table, lechem haponim, let's do it simply like this. Everyone knows what we mean by this is the lechem haponim, but it may well have been that this was the structure really in the Beis Hamikdash. I just put that forward as a possibility. We shouldn't get too hung up by what we see on the coins. Okay. Let's go a bit further than this. I just want to share with you some interesting Gemaras on lechem haponim. Let's go a bit further. But the first thing I want to share with you is this strange fact that the lechem haponim we stated was matzah. And how on earth do you get matzah that looks like this, you may ask? And you may well be skeptical. In fact, I think the thickness was about 1 tefach, a fist. That means that it's like having matzah in this extraordinary shape, which was a fist in depth. Well, our matzah, even the matzah that we have, shmura matzah, is a quarter of a finger in depth rather than a whole fist in depth. So it seems quite extraordinary that they could actually bake like that. But matzah used to be much thicker than it used to be, than it is today. And I just found an interesting article over here. I just flagged this up, which is relevant really to the way we look at the matzahs we use today in our Seder. It just takes us far away from the showbread, etc., and shows us that matzah of the form we just see above is not to be considered impossible. It was quite possible to make matzah like that. So this is part of an article, and it says by the 17th century, matzah had thinned out to about the thickness of a finger. Well, you wouldn't even want to eat matzah today. That was the thickness of a finger. This is much more like Sephardi matzah. But we're talking about Ashkenazi matzah. We are not talking about Sephardi matzah. Now, the thickness of a finger is still pretty thick. And that was by the 17th century. Everyone was using thinner matzah. And what is thinner matzah? 1 finger thick, not the flat pancakes that we have today. We've gone well off the derech in the type of matzah that we use today. So when you look at it and you think, well, ha lachma anya, this is the bread of affliction. Well, maybe it wasn't the bread of affliction. Maybe the bread of affliction was much, much thicker than what we have today. It was still soft, and so would not stay fresh for more than a few days. The soft matzah that was thick. It explains that matzah became thinner and more cracker-like due to concerns that the bread wasn't entirely cooked within and therefore not kosher for Passover. More and more poskim were concerned that when you make this thick matzah, which is the traditional matzah, that the bakers, in turning out large amounts of it, were not necessarily producing matzah that was Pesach thick anymore, because when you have a lot of thickness and some of the heat doesn't reach the center and doesn't bake the dough in the middle, and therefore you might actually have chometz with the water seeping in, and you have chometz. It's unbaked water and dough. So that's one of the problems with soft matzah, thick soft matzah. Another interesting trend arose during the 18th century. There was a greater demand for more shelf-stable matzah that wouldn't start to mold. By adding less water in the mixture and kneading longer and with more effort, matzah bakers were able to achieve extremely thin, crunchy matzah that took days or even weeks to spoil. By the end of the 18th century, hard matzah was the new norm. Right? So we're eating, in the Ashkenazi world today, certainly, modern matzah, which is just highly convenient, lasts longer on the shelves, and that's the only reason that we have the matzah that we have today. However, the original matzah was not like that at all. It could have been much thicker, even though there was a chance of it spoiling. And as I say, the Mishnah says it was a nace in the Beis Hamikdash that the soft, thick matzah of the lechem aponim remained fresh from the beginning of the week to the end, when there's a real risk of it spoiling, given the fact that it has such thickness and so much water in it. I just put this in as well. Soft matzah has advantages for the Seder. It's better suited for Korach. Some try to say, oh, you know what? It's clear that the matzah we have today with a flat, crunchy pancakes was not at all what they had in the Beis Hamikdash. What does Korach mean? Korach means a sandwich. And a lot of the Sephardim actually say it's patently obvious that the soft matzah, which you can curl around, doesn't crack instantly, and you can make a shawarma type thing with your carbon Pesach, is precisely what Hillel had in his Korach. He certainly didn't have flat, crunchy, breaking, crumbling matzah together with carbon Pesach. That's completely ridiculous. So that's one argument. If you want to remain more loyal to what the Korach sandwich is, then you've got to have your soft, bendy matzah. It's usually, and the other thing is, it's usually whole. You know, the problem we have finding shleimus, that's one of the big, hunt a complete matzah, especially if you have machine baked. It comes out of a box, it's already broken at the edges, etc. Well, if you have the soft stuff, because it's flexible, it's less likely to break, and therefore you're more likely to find complete matzot. It's easier to eat the required shear. Instead of having to eat 1.5 crunchy matzahs, you only have to eat a fairly small section of a thicker matzah, and it'll all go down together. And it's just more palatable in that sense, and it's more genuinely like the original eaten by our ancestors. And that's what we really think it is. So anyway, you may have other views, but the soft matzah was used, and it became the lechem haponim. And by some master bakers, they were able to produce something that looked like this. Okay. So how do they do the baking? I've also got a section here, famous Gemara from Masechet Yuma, that talks about the family that had the contract to bake the lechem haponim for the Beis Hamikdash. And they kept this through generation and generation. It's like, remember in London, we used to have Grudzinski's, family butchers since 1828 or whatever it was. So there was a family then at the time of the Beis Hamikdash, and they were called Beit Garmu. So the Gemara says here, I'm going to translate this lovely Gemara, Beis Garmu hayubakin b'masa lechem haponim. They were experts. This family, household called Garmu, were experts in baking the lechem haponu, v'lo rotzu lelamed, and they did not wish to teach anyone else. They kept the craft and the secret of baking the lechem haponim, the formula, how hot the oven was, how they attached it to the oven when they took it out. It was entirely kept within the family. It's like the Coca-Cola formula. No one's supposed to know. But he only wanted that family to do it, and they were being paid for it. They didn't want any competition. That seems to be the case. Chazal were not happy with them. So Sholchu Chachamim v'hevi'u umanin mil Alexandria shel Mitzrayim. You know what? They sent out what do you call it when you sent it out for other people to come in as a possible tender? And there were bakers who came from Alexandria in Mitzrayim who said, we can do exactly the same, and we're not going to charge so much, and we're prepared to teach other people. And the Chacham thought, good idea. And they claimed to be able to bake as well as Beis Garmu. But lo hayu yodim lerudos kamosan. Ridias hapas, it's a very interesting thing that we still see it today when you look at some of the bakeries that bake pitot, etc. You have an oven and they fling the pita against the side of the oven and it adheres to the oven, and then they scrape it off. It's not just left at the bottom. And that malacha of scraping off is called ridiat hapat. If you throw dough against an oven, then when you scrape it off and take it off, it requires great skill, as much skill to scrape off the bread from the side of the oven than it does to put put all the contents together and bake it in the first place. Requires a very quick sleight of hand in a very hot oven, very difficult to achieve without breaking it. So that's the ridia they were not expert in. Why? And he goes on to explain why they were not so successful, these Alexandrians. Shahalalu masikin bebechutz va'ofen bebechutz v'haloli masikin bebefnim va'ofen bifnim. The Beit Garmu, they used to put the fire in the oven. They used to heat it at a very high temperature, and it would bake the lechem haponim, these big loaves, these matzah loaves, all the way through. But even though they were thick, it used to bake solid all the way through because of the heat. And then they were able to scrape it off the side of the oven. But the Alexandrians weren't able to reproduce that. They didn't want to do that. They heated it from the outside, and it wasn't at the right temperature. And when they scraped it off, we'll see what happens. Halolu piton misapeshes, the Alexandrian version went moldy more quickly. V'halolu ein piton misapeshes, but Beis Garmu's version always remained fresh. And also, it's said that they weren't able to bring it off in one piece in the same way as the Beis Garmu were able to. And when they heard about this, that in fact it wasn't so successful, and the Alexandrians were making a mess of producing the lechem haponim, which was needed. So Amru, they said, Kol ma shebora kodesh baruch hu lichvoda baroro, shenemar kol hanikra b'shvi v'lichvodi barasiv. Obviously, HaKadosh Baruch has created everything for his own honor. And it seems Hashem is saying that even though these are fine gentlemen from Alexandria, he doesn't want them to be involved in baking his lechem upon him. We better go back to Beis Garmu and apologize for having replaced them. So v'chozru Beis HaGarmu limkomon, and the Beis Garmu returned to their original roles as the bakers. Sholchu lahem chachamim v'lo bo'u. At first, when the chachamim sent for them and said, please come back, all is forgiven, we made a mistake, they refused to return. So how did they come back? They were enticed by doubling their wages. Sometimes happens. Koflu lahem schar unavo. So they asked for double their original wages and they returned. And there was no alternative because no one else was able to produce at the same. Not much changes, as you can see over here, over the millennia. Anyway, b'chol yom hayunotlim shneim osa mona. They took 12 mona for each day's work, which is quite a lot of money. Originally, v'hayom esrim v'arba, but they doubled it to 24. Rabbi Yehuda Omar b'chol yom esrim v'arba v'hayom arba mishmona. Rabbi Yehuda says it was originally 24, and they doubled their salary requirements to 48 mana per day. So now the dialogue goes on between the Chachamim and the Beis Garmu. Amr lahem Chachamim said to the family of Garmu, Mari isam shelo lelamed. Why don't you want to teach your skill to anyone else? Now, you know what the answer should be, because if we teach it to anybody else, we'll be replaced by someone who's prepared to do it. You know, the Chinese will come in and they'll charge half the price. So obviously we're not going to teach it to anyone. But now listen to what they say. It's remarkable because we've got them all wrong. You got them all wrong. You misassessed them from the basis of that story so far, as we'll see, because it's all in the tail here. Amru lahem. So they said to the Chacham, you know why we don't want to teach anyone? Yodim hayu shel beis Abba shebeis baizer oset licharev. We've had a tradition in our family, going back generations, that this Beis HaMikdash will one day be destroyed. And we're baking now, but one day this Beis HaMikdash will not be here anymore. Shema yilmod adam she'ena mehugan v'yelech v'yavod avodah zara b'kach. We're concerned that after the Beis HaMikdash is destroyed, anyone we might teach now, their family, who are not as loyal as we are to Torah, might decide to sell their skill craft to others, and perhaps do so not to worship HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but for the sake of honoring some avodah zara. And therefore we refuse to teach. We'll want to keep it within the family. We can only trust ourselves to continue to use this skill in God's service. And so the Gemara ends up here. For this response, Chazal mentioned this family now for praise. At first, they didn't like them at all. They thought it was just a way of, keeping it inside their shop for themselves. But now they see they actually had the right motivations. And the Gemara says something else very interesting. Me'olam lo nimtzas pas nakir biyad b'neihem. They always made sure, the Beis Garmu, that there would never be any fine baking for the purposes of their own domestic needs at home. They reserved their baking skills with finest flour to make the finest loaves only for the lechem haponim. But when it came to baking for themselves, they used cruder systems. Why? And it's a wonderful reason. She'ilo yomru mimasa lechem haponim ze nizonim. Because if they were eating fine bread or fine matzah at home, people might say, you know what? They made extra lechem haponim with the finest ingredients, and they're eating lechem haponim, and they shouldn't be eating lechem haponim. They wanted to be mikaim, this posuk that a person should always not only be innocent of sin, but appear outwardly to everyone else as innocent of sin. No one should suspect that what they're doing within the base, what they're doing at home, is any derivative of the work they're doing for the Beis HaMikdash. So they would eat, bread from Angel's Bakery at home, just to make it clear that they were not using their own skill and craft and maybe using some of the excess that they were baking from the lechem aponim for their own aggrandizement at home. The Gemara says something similar about the family that made the besomim, the spices. It says something similar. There was a family there as well, that Beis Avtinas, I think it was, that was responsible for making the besomim, which had a particular formula, and they also kept it to themselves. And the Gemara says there that the family Beis Avtinas, their daughters always used to go out unperfumed. It's exactly the same idea of this. Why? Because otherwise people will say, you know what? Some of this besomim, these spices, they're using for their daughters. They go out, they want a shidduch, they're going out on a date, so they're dosing themselves up with some of the scent that has been used for the besomim. So specifically to avoid all suspicion, they didn't want their children, their daughters, to be at all perfumed in order to avoid any such suspicion. Very interesting and very lovely Gemara. We also mentioned the shtei halechem. The shtei halechem were these two loaves, and they were chometz on Shavuot. And here's a picture of the guy with a lechem, with a shtei halechem. Only two loaves over here. And he's got a lamb in his hand. He's got a lamb, and it's a very, very beautiful picture. And here we have the loaves, and they're not quite the same. They just have these knobbles on them. I'm not sure whether this is tradition or whether this is just the way it's drawn. I'm not sure we have the same tradition on the shtei halechem as we do on the lechem aponim, and with the actual shapes and everything. But here's what the picture shows. There are only two loaves, and as I say, these are chometz. They're also thick. Okay, I'm going to quit sharing now. We go to the Gemara. We'll start the Gemara. Enough bakery. So we're moving we're moving to 1, 2, 3, 5 lines from the bottom of the page. The Gemara starts Imorei haragolim. Okay, so the Gemara now here asks a question. The vocabulary, the terminology in the Mishnah seems to be faulty. I didn't raise this for you. I could have raised it as we were doing the Mishnah, but it seems to be a bit faulty because the Mishnah said that on 3 occasions in the year, all the 24 groups come together and share equally. And what? Be'emurei haragolim. Be'emurei haragolim. Now, the word emurim has a specific meaning in Karbonos, which makes it difficult to understand in the context of what we're trying to say in the Mishnah. I said to you, it means that the bits that the Kohanim eat, were divided equally amongst all 24 groups. And that's obviously what the meaning that the Mishnah wishes to impart. It can't be the bits that they don't eat, because they don't eat it, they're not entitled to it. The problem is, emurim are the innards of an animal which are placed on the Mizbeach and are totally burnt up. And they're not given to the Kohanim to eat. So that's the question of the Gemara. Emurei haragolim, there should be a question mark if you can imagine, if we had punctuation. Shall gavoa minhu, says the Gemara, gavoa of the high one. Surely the emurim are placed on the Mizbeach as a carbon to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, so to speak. They just get burnt up. That's all. So they're not apportioned to the Kohanim at all. So what's the Mishnah saying? That all the Amorim of the Karbonos on the Regolim were divided amongst the 24. The Amorim are always burnt up. That's the definition. The Amorim are the bits that are burnt up on the Mizbeach. So what's going on in the Mishnah? So we have to find a way in which we can translate Amorim differently, not the normal way, which means those parts which are sent to the Mizbeach and burnt up completely. So Amar Rav Chisda suggests, Masha Amor Regolim. I'm afraid this is terribly, you probably cringe when you see this particular answer over here, because it's certainly not what the Mishnah spells out, but maybe it's the only way we can understand it to be meaningful at all. Amorim here does not mean the innards of the technical parts of the carbon that are placed on the Mizbeach and are completely burnt up. But what it means to say Amorim means Amorim. Knock out the word yet, the yud on Amorim between the aleph and the mem, and you have Amorim. Those things that are said, like Lemar, Omer, Amar. Those things that are said on the Regolim, what does that mean? It means those parts of the Karbonos, those Karbonos which are said in the Torah to be part of the ritual of Yom Tov. So those are the parts that are shared. But it's the Amorim. It does not mean the bits that are put up on the Mizbeach. It means those korbanos that are stated, Amorim, Ne'emah, that are said in the Torah to be part of the ritual of Yom Tov. That those are the edible parts, and it's those parts which are divided across all 24 groups. Okay, now the Gemara is going to take us back to the Mishnah, but it's going to quote a brisa, which gives us an origin of the division across all the 24 mishmaros. How do we know that these are split across the 24 mishmaros? So, Tana Rabbanon, this is a brisa, our rabbis taught, Minayin shekol ha-mishmaros shovos be'emurei haragolim. That statement, we have the Mishnah, which means that all the 24 mishmaros are entitled to take part in the consumption of the bits that they're entitled to from the korbanos hachag. How do we know it? And what's the source? I mean, the Mishnah gives us a source, but Minayin always means where do we know from the Torah? Where does the Torah tell us that there is an equal division? Maybe it should just go to the Mishmar HaKavua. Maybe it should just go to the group that has its rota. Who says that should be divided across all 24 Mishmarot? So says the Gemara Talmud, Loma, because the Torah teaches us, and this is in Devarim Yud Ches, and I'm going to show it to you on the screen and share it with you on the screen. But the Gemara here says, Ubachol avas nafsho v'sheres. Whenever he wishes to, he shall serve. So let me just share the screen so you can see the verse, because as always, the Gemara has given you a very partial. It's this one, I believe. Let me just make this smaller so you can see the verse. Okay. So the Torah says, when a Levi comes from one of your gates, which literally means when he comes from one of your towns in Eretz Yisrael. And when it says Levi here, read Cohen. If you don't read Cohen here, then you learn nothing from this at all. And the commentators say that the word Levi, the Kohanim are a subset of the tribe of Levi. And it's clear from the context that we're talking about the people who are working in the avodah of the Beis HaMikdash. So even though it says Levi, it means Cohen. If he comes from one of your settlements throughout Eretz Yisrael, Mikol Yisrael, Asher Garsham, wherever he comes from, and he's coming to the Beis HaMikdash, what does he want to do? He wants to take a part of the avodah. He wants to take part in the avodah. Uvo b'chol avas nafsho. He may come whenever he pleases. El hamakom asher yivcha Hashem. To the place that Hashem shall choose. It's interesting, actually, because when you read this somewhat goes against the idea of the Mishmarot. The Mishmaros means that there is a rota, which means this week it's my turn, next week it's your turn. If you read the Posuk, it suggests that even though we may have a rota, in theory, a Kohen can just decide when he wants to come along. And it seems that what happened was that some Seder was made, even though in principle, a Kohen can come and just say, I fancy going to the Beis HaMikdash and being a Kohen on the 3rd of March. That in practice, because of the chaos that would produce, people would want to come at certain times of year, etc. You'd have too few Kohanim sometimes, too many Kohanim at other times. That they did institute this rota system, the 24 Mishmaros. But in principle, they can all come together if they wish to. That's the simple meaning of the pasuk. He may serve in the name of Hashem, his God, together with all the other Kohanim. And this is actually what happens, if you like, on the Shalosh Regalim, where they do all come together. That's certainly a day when they all come together. Hashem, who stand before Hashem. And he goes on to say, the next piece we'll see later on, it's not so important now, they may eat together, portion in equal shares of portions of Vadmim Korov ala Ovos. We'll explain what that means later on. But the Pasuk is really focusing on the fact that Kohanim will come together. So when do they come together? Literally, as I said to you, this Pasuk suggests they can come together whenever they want. But now let's have a look at the Brisa. The Brisa is going to restrict it in terms of a requirement to the Chagim. This pasuk doesn't mention Chagim. Let's have a look at the Brisa and see. So the pasuk we have quoted in our Brisa here is a B'chol Avos Nafsho V'Sheres. Just stop sharing for a moment. Whenever he wished, he may come and join together with his brethren, even though normally he may have a mishmar kavua, they may be a rota, but they may come together nonetheless and all work in the avoda of the day. So says the Brisa now is going to take this pasuk in a more restrictive way than the way we translated it for a moment in order to make its point. So yochol af be'ashar shemos hashana, you might think that entitlement applies to any day of the year, which is what I suggested to you before from the simple translation, which means any day of the year a Kohen wants to wake up in the morning and he feels doesn't want to go to work in the office. He wants to go to the Beis HaMikdash as a Kohen, and he's entitled to serve. You might think that's what it means, says the Brisa, and indeed it seems to mean that, but says the Brisa, no, if you look more carefully, you can see the Torah is hinting that that's not the case. Talmud Loma, that's why if you look in the Pasuk, it adds the words me'achad she'orecha. Yes, it says if he comes from one of your gates, I translated that from one of your settlements, and he wants to come into Yerushalayim. That's the meaning, but the Brisa is going to usurp those words for a secondary meaning. B'shah lo amarti, when am I speaking about the Kohen being able to come in and join with all the other Kohanim? That's only Ela b'shah shekol Yisrael nichnosim b'shah echad. Only in a time when all Bnei Yisrael enter into Yerushalayim through one gate. Now that's a little bit of a kvetch. Let's just go back to sharing. But as we've often seen, Droshot Chazal sometimes take verses out of their simple meaning. I translated this bit over here, V'chiyovo halevi me'achad she'arecha, to mean that when a Kohen comes from one of your towns where he happens to have a family home and he wants to come into the Beis HaMikdash, says the Brisa, let's distort this pasuk a little bit. We have a bit of license. Instead of me'achad she'arecha, let's change that mem to a base, b'achad she'arecha. And then it means, almost, it's not an opposite meaning, but it's a very different meaning. When a Kohen shall come into that gate, which is used by the whole of Klal Yisrael in unison. I'm afraid it's a bit of a distortion. When would a Kohen enter into a gate which is used by all Klal Yisrael in unison? On the Shalosh Regalim. What do we mean by the gate? We mean the gates of the Beis HaMikdash. Everybody comes in from all parts of Eretz Yisrael, and they come into the gate, if you like, of Yerushalayim in unison. So says the Brisa, this pasuk is teaching us that the right of a Kohen to come in and serve when it's not his Rota Shabbat, when it's not his Rota week, he only has that right to come in when it's not his Rota week, if it's one of those occasions when all of Klal Yisrael come into the Beis HaMikdash together. That's the way the Brisa is explaining this verse, which means on the Shalosh Regalim, because of course Klal Yisrael can come in on any day of the year and people can come to the Beis HaMikdash whenever they want, but the only time that they all come together is during Aliyah L'Regel, and therefore this means that the 24 Mishmarot work together in unison only on the Shalosh Regalim. Otherwise, they have their Mishmar Kavua, you know, when your Rota week is, and you come in during your Rota week. Okay, that's the way the Gemara understands, or the Brisa understands this pasuk, and this is a proof for the fact that the Kohanim come together as a group on those Shalosh Regalim occasions. They come together as 24 groups. Otherwise, they have their specific allocated week. The Mishnah went on to say, "Ubechilek lechem haponim." Our Mishnah said also, they all share in the lechem haponim. Now, this was, as I mentioned to you when I mentioned to you during the Mishnah, as we translated it before, a little bit more surprising. surely the lechem haponim, the showbread, was refreshed. It was a ritual that was a weekly ritual every Shabbat. And therefore, it was not a designated ritual for Yom Tov. But if Shabbos falls on the Yom Tov, then it's there. You have a Shabbat, lechem haponim on Yom Tov, but it's not a Yom Tov ritual as such. And we said before that the sharing amongst the 24 mishmoros is only really for those Yom Tov specific rituals and not for the ones which are not Yom Tov specific. So we said, for example, the Nedarim and the Nedavot that were brought to the Beis HaMikdash, which are not Yom Tov specific, would only be done, those activities would be done only by the Mishmar HaKavua, the one that had the normal weekly rota. They're not Yom Tov specific. They're not allocated across all 24 groups, just the specific group of the week. So why is the lechem haponim allocated across all 24? The Mishnah said it was, despite the fact that it's only a carbon that is a weekly carbon. It is not a Yom Tov specific carbon. It seems to break the mold here of this differential between karbonos hachag and the normal karbonos. We have here the lechem haponim that is brought by everyone and is apportioned to everyone, despite it being a normal weekly event. So that's why the Brisa asked the question, Minayin shekol hamishmor Shabbos bechilik lechem haponim. From where do we see a Torah source, if you like, that the lechem haponim was divided amongst all 24 groups, when, as we know, it wasn't really a chag carbon? So the Torah Gemara says we learn it from the end of that pasuk that I just shared with you before. This is a carryover pasuk. It says, "Chelek mechelek yochelu." They shall all share in it together. That sounds like all 24 mishmaros are here together. You wouldn't really say it about if it was just one mishmar, the mishmar hakavua, the normal, they are one group. But when it says chelek chelek yochelu, it means that every one of the 24 mishmaros gets a share. Levad mimkorov al ha'avos, without regard, he says, to personal gifts or patrimonies, whatever it is. That means that it doesn't apply to other things that they have, which are weekly entitlements for their week. But there is something which is eaten chelek b'chelek yochelu. The Gemara is going to have to show this replies to the lechem haponim. I'm telling you that the Brisa is learning this to mean that when it comes to the lechem haponim, even though we're talking about the chag, because remember, this is all part of the continuum of verses, which is when the Bnei Yisrael come in through me'achad sharecha on the regel. On those occasions, if it's Shabbat and there is lechem haponim, chelek b'chelek yochelu. Each of the 24 mishmaros we share together. So I say the Gemara has the final task of proving that chelek b'chelek yochelu is not referring simply to the other karbonos of the chag. How do you know that's anything to do with lechem haponim? Who says it's lechem haponim? Maybe it's referring to the specific Yom Tov karbonos, which are divided amongst the 24. So the Gemara says, kachelek avoda kachelek achila, just like they're all entitled to work together on the lechem haponim and all the other avodas, so also they're entitled to eat. Says the Gemara, umay achila. I just want to do this last bit. How do we know what he means by eating? Chelek chelek yochelu. Maybe this is eating of the karbonos. Who says this is the eating of the lechem haponim? Which is less likely, because as I say, it's not really a Yom Tov specific ceremonial. So it says the Gemara, it has to mean lechem haponim. Because if you want to say Yilema Karbonos, if you're saying it means that the 24 mishmaros share in the Karbonos of the Chag, which we know they do, but if you say that this verse, this Chelik Yochelu, is merely reinforcing that it's referring to the Karbonos, then it doesn't make sense. Why? Mehasam nafka. What do I need to learn it from here? I don't need to learn it from here. La Kohen HaMakriv Osa Lo Sehiyeh. The Gemara says, here, I can learn it from a pasuk in Sefer Vayikra, which says that the Kohanim who are offering it, to them it shall belong. And therefore, all the mishmaros who are working on all those other karbonos, they're obviously entitled to share on on the for the korbanos hachag. In other words, we know that information already. When this posuk is saying chelik v'chelik yochelu, it cannot be referring to something we already know from another verse. It has to be referring to something new. What is it that we don't know? Lechem aponim. So the Gemara wants to say, almost by a sense of elimination here, that this chelik v'chelik yochelu means that all the 24 mishmaros share in the eating of the lechem aponim, despite the fact that it's not a particular ceremonial which is based upon the Chagoni. It's something that takes place every Shabbat. And we'll stop over here. It's been a bit technical today, but that's the Inyan of the Yom. Second.